I know right before the pandemic hit, you were covering a story about climate change. And I thought that was interesting because I just started a series on um, disabilities and climate change, and how, how climate change will affect uh, people with disabilities, and how we will be hit harder than, and has already been hit harder than other groups, other minority groups. And so why do you think people with disabilities should be included in climate change, especially in light of the story that you started to do and hopefully will get to finish after the pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's very simple. We're part of the human race. You know, we are part of what goes on in this planet, and we should have a say in how we maintain the planet. And also, generally, when there's any sort of disaster, when there are any major problems in the world, the people who get hit the hardest are the most vulnerable. And at the moment, it's disabled people. You look at the stats and on disabled people who are living in poverty around the world. More people with disabilities are living in poverty around the world than any other group. More people with disabilities are not given access to education. And if you don't have access to education, you're more likely to be abused, you're more likely to be living in poverty. And so we will be impacted by climate change. And one of the big things that climate change is going to cause is displacement of people. At the moment, the third biggest source of frozen water is in the Himalayas, in the mountains, and those ice caps in the mountains are melting because of climate change, because of temperature rises. And when as they start melting, they create what's called glacial pools, huge glacial pools. So I traveled to Bhutan, and in Bhutan, they have at the bottom of the Himalayas, on the outskirts of Bhutan, up in the mountains, these glacial pools are forming at the bottom of the mountains. And these pools are massive pools of ice, which are caused by the ice coming down from the mountains and dislodging lots of debris. And they can be up to 5 kilometers long and over a kilometer deep. Now, when they melt, they create huge floods. And what the big worry is, they will flood. Sooner or later, masses of these glacial pools are going to open up and flood the whole of Bhutan, but also the whole of the Hindu Kush. So that will be most of India, that will be big parts of China, most of Sri Lanka, most of Bangladesh, big parts of that area. And it's going to affect 1 billion people. The water supply of 1 billion people will be affected by the melting of these ice caps. And what happens when these people's water supply is affected? They move. And when they move, right, it causes tension and turmoil in the countries that they move to, and the people who are affected are going to be, say, people with disabilities. It's harder for people with disabilities to move. They get left behind. They get seen as collateral damage. So we have to fight, and we have to be involved in changing or taking care of our planet. Otherwise, disabled people's lives are going to be damaged exponentially all over the world.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And speaking of the, tremendous disaster and that high volume of displacement, do you have have you thought of ideas for evacuation plan, for these kinds of disastrous situations? Um, you know, how can we better include people in disaster evacuation plans?
Mm.
especially as in situations that you just described and more, droughts, fires, things that we've just seen over in Australia and also
Yeah.
California in terms of fires, but also, many, many other kinds of disasters.
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to think of how do we prevent those disasters, because it's in our hands, to stop climate change, or to slow climate change down. And but what needs to happen in the next 10 years is for us to change our way of lives. I think by the time it gets to the evacuation and disaster plans, it is kind of too late. It's become we're already in a position where we're trying to recover from something that will become really, really difficult to stop. So I think we have to, right now, start eating less meat. We have to start extracting less from the planet, burning less fossil fuels, trying to live in a way that is more in tune with our planet. Um, and there are solutions. There are alternatives to the way we're living at the moment. At the moment, we live a lifestyle that is too based on consumerism. And the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics and human nature shows that if you keep taking, you're going to deplete, and there'll be nothing left. And that's what we're doing to our planet. We're constantly extracting resources from the planet, but not putting anything back. And what we got to remember, I don't know, maybe I haven't got a crystal ball. I haven't been able to travel around the universe to see what is out there. But I believe what we have on this planet is the best we're going to get. I don't think anywhere else out there in the solar system is going to match what we have on our planet Earth. The human life is a miracle. The things that had to happen in order for us to be alive on this planet, which has taken billions of years of evolution to happen, is incredible. And if we destroy it, I can't say I don't believe there will be anything else out there. There are people who are talking about space travel and going to other planets. I think first and foremost, we need to take care of what we have here, because it's beautiful, it's amazing, and the human race is a miracle, and we have to cherish that.
Very, very passionately and well said. And so, as a last closing question, what questions do you still have? I know you're doing a story on climate change, but what questions do you have, or did you ask, for leading environmentalists in the world, on including people with disabilities in this discussion? What still needs to be addressed for people with disabilities?
Mm. Um, I think when you put the question that way, it always boils down to the question of inequality. How do we strive towards ending inequality? And what people who are working, because there are so many solutions out there to help us solve the problems that are being caused by ourselves, that are leading to climate change. And these solutions can kind of lead to a new way of thinking, to almost a new beginning for us and for the next generation. So we have an opportunity now to create a future where we start from scratch. And when we start from scratch, we can eradicate those mistakes that we've made from the past. So I asked these people, what are you doing that is not only going to save the planet, but is going to make sure that it includes every person with a disability? And I think it's there. They look at technology. The driverless cars could be, you know, once we find a way of having driverless cars that are completely safe. I have friends who are visually impaired who, for them, they can't wait for driverless cars because at the moment they have no independence. They have to rely on a sighted person to get around anywhere, you know. And if we have a driverless electric car or driverless LPG car, you know, or that's something that uses natural, that doesn't you burn fossil fuels, and that can be driverless, then that's going to help people with visual impairment. You know, if we start making buildings that are accessible and environmentally friendly, right, then we don't have to constantly knock down buildings and rebuild them in the future. We make them future proof. For instance, my house, um, I've had to put a lift in my house and put ramps and stuff in my house. That means my house is future proof. And what I constantly ask the environmentalists out there is, what can we do to future proof our planet?
Yeah, exactly. And that was beautifully said. And thank you so much for coming on. I know it's afternoon in London. It's morning here in the US in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for being so passionate, so curious, and so generous with your time.
Ming, thank you so much. You know, and yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Your questions were amazing, really, really good questions, and yeah, best of luck. And sorry if I talk too much. I know I talk a lot, so I'm really looking forward to this podcast. I hope it goes well for you, and yeah, say hi to everyone out there in Washington. You know, I know it's a bit crazy in the US at the moment, but you know, good luck to you guys out there.